Good morning, Carter. How are you?
Morning, Jamie. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, thank you so much for making the time to join this series of Sentientist conversations. And I frame it as an attempt to delve into two of the most important and deepest philosophical questions. What's real and how should we choose what to believe about our universe? And just as critically, what and who matters ethically. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to frame and popularize this very simple worldview that in a sentence says we should commit to using evidence and reason and have compassion for all sentient beings. So it takes a naturalistic approach about understanding reality, methodologically speaking, if you like. And then when it comes to ethics, it says essentially all suffering matters, all beings that can suffer or flourish should count in our moral consideration. But I'm so lucky in these conversations to talk to an incredible diversity of people, some of whom agree with that philosophy and others who disagree with parts or all of it. So yeah, it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and where you are now, what the implications are for the future. But before we get into those deep questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
Well, my name is Carter Dillard. I'm policy director for Fair Start Movement. It's a organization, but also steers a coalition of many organizations. And the goal of which is pretty straightforward. It's to move from a current paradigm of family planning that's really universal, that focuses on fulfilling parents' subjective desire or what parents want. And we want to move that to a system that's really child-centric, that is focused on an objective standard for what future children need. And so you're really moving from what parents want to what children need. And the latter comes with very specific guidelines, things like the Children's Rights Convention. There's no need to go into grand speculation. It's just a matter of prioritizing those needs in family planning and not just in parenting. And so we try to move that standard back to the planning stage. And we find that doing so has a tremendous impact on reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, and really would move the world from a potential future of 12 to 14 billion people with mass inequity, really people designed for economic growth systems, instead towards a future of 4 to 6 billion people with high levels of equity, high levels of development, and the restoration of natural ecosystems. So really two different futures, depending on whether we stay the parent-focused course or we go into a child-centric course. And we urge the latter as what we consider to be the first and overriding human right, the right to a fair start in life. So that's my job, and that's the background.
Yeah, fascinating. And we'll come back to that in our final question about how to make a better future. And my instinct would be that, and we'll dig into this, that this focus on parental rights isn't about ignoring the rights of children. It's a more intuitive sense that the best people to represent the rights of the children are their own parents. And I guess that's one of the things that you dig into and tease apart the degree to which that's a safe assumption and an ethical assumption to make. But yeah, it'll be fascinating to come back to that as we look at the final question. So as we come on to these two meaty philosophical questions, the first one is, what's real, or how should we go about believing? So for many of my guests, they answer it in different ways, but for many of them, it's a story about whether they grew up in a sort of quite naturalistic, maybe scientific-minded, maybe agnostic or atheistic household and context, or one that was more supernatural and spiritual or religious, and how their philosophy has shifted over time about the nature of reality and how to believe and what to believe, if it has changed at all. So yeah, you can wind the clock back as far as you like, but it would be fascinating to know your story on, I guess, epistemology and belief.
Sure. Yeah, and I sort of look at it in three stages. My early childhood development, I was fortunately exposed to people who had strong beliefs about civil rights movement in the United States. And it was a naturalistic basis that assumptions about racial divisions, assumptions about racial inferiority or superiority had previously been based on scientific conclusions that were absolutely incorrect. And that the justifications for racism under a naturalistic lens fell apart. And so from that perspective, civil rights was as much about truth as it was about justice. And from that perspective, I sort of migrated, as a lot of people did, into a second phase where I wanted to also apply that to non-humans, because scientific justifications for the denigration of non-humans also fell apart under scrutiny. Like a lot of people, I was heavily influenced by Peter Singer's work, and others wanting to apply the lessons of the civil rights movement to animal rights movement. It really entered a third phase as I began to work on population and what we call fair start modeling. And that was not seeing these movements, civil rights and animal rights, as separate, but in fact, seeing them as aligned if we move from a focus on suffering to a focus on what you, I think, call flourishing, or what I might call relative autonomy. This idea, not only could you respect sentient beings' right to not suffer, but also respect their right to live the lives of their genuine choosing. And so a third phase really has been looking specifically at how the climate crisis has and will, to a large extent, limit both human and non-humans' interest in living lives that are relatively free of others' influence, that are flourishing, that are autonomous, and how to try to maximize the aligned value that they have. So I think it comes from a naturalistic background with my family, some interest in civil rights, and the idea that that systems we were used to were based on naturalistic fallacies, and moving into the usual thinking about suffering and now towards autonomy and wanting to align non-human and human autonomy by limiting the impacts of the climate crisis.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the one response to looking at that, what I would argue, I would agree, was, bad science of, racial differences and so on. And that was motivated in a sense, and that warped the conclusions. One approach, which it sounds like you and many others and I have taken, which is replace that with better science and realize it was bullshit and correct the record, right? And still keep a naturalistic basis. Another approach is to give up on a naturalistic scientific understanding and so we need something supernatural to justify, for example, we all have souls and therefore there's a different approach. But again, my bias is pretty clear, and I think it's almost incontrovertibly a stronger way of going about it is to engage honestly with reality and use that as a basis for our ethics as well. But you've demonstrated already that it's so hard to keep these two questions of what's real and what matters separate, because I think while some do like this sort of really strict is-ought distinction, I think for most other people, there are natural links, whether or not you have a supernatural worldview or a natural worldview. So you talked about your family taking, I guess, a naturalistic approach to ethics. Were they more broadly naturalistic as well in terms of, religion, the supernatural, spirituality? Were they more broadly naturalistic and scientific in their mindset and their worldview? How would they just have described themselves?
Yeah, no, I would say they were more broadly naturalistic. I mean, I think whether we acknowledged it or not, science had become God at some point, in the 20th century and certainly into the 21st century. Whether it's applied in economics or applied through other sciences, I think it's irrefutably the largest determinant of human thinking and therefore behavior. And so my family and my thinking fell in line with that, immediately wanting to look for scientific reasons to alter your behavior in a way that made it ethical. And so an assumption about non-humans' ability to lead autonomous lives that was based on faulty science. The best way to correct that is to supply better science. And so, for example, the past 20 years, what we've learned about non-human cognition really, should embarrass decades and decades of human living as completely unethical. And now we no longer have to be other regarding about it by not respecting non-human autonomy, by overrunning the natural world. We are now suffering the refraction ethically in the form of the climate crisis. And it's our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren that will suffer the most because we fail to respect the non-human world. So it seems irrefutable scientifically, and that is, to me, leads to an immediate ought about how we should live, whether you're other regarding or self-regarding.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like your story is fairly straightforward. You grew up in a naturalistic context. You've largely stuck with that. Many of my guests have followed a path where they grew up maybe in a fairly formal organized religion and then moved towards a more naturalistic way of thinking, atheistic or agnostic. And some like me just stuck there. I'm still in that worldview now, whether when it comes to religion or any other belief, I try and ground it on evidence and reason, and that is it, right? There's no other factor. Others have left maybe a more formalized, organized religion with a structured set of supernatural views, and they've moved away from that, but then have later on adopted some maybe spirituality without religion, or a sense of things beyond the natural world that then affects their worldview as well. And for some people, that is an explicit, there is something else out there that is ineffable and we will never find evidence of, but I still feel it's real in some sense. And for other people, it's a softer, still naturalistic sense of connectedness and sort of awe and wonder, but it's still in the scientific worldview. Have there been other aspects of your worldview that have, where you've been tempted by concepts of spirituality or going beyond the natural world and a scientific understanding? And the answer may well be no. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it really is no, because I think
it's fortunately no.
Yeah. I'm thinking if I had experienced it and then come back to naturalism, I might have a better critique of it. But I haven't so much, because wanting to find objective reasons for like a norm that we might all agree to follow so that other people would see those objective reasons led me to be wary of looking for subjective reasons. So I have a belief, but I have trouble justifying that belief to other people. Whereas I think like Thomas Nagel's work, showing The View from Nowhere, where showing that my recognition of pain in someone else is what enables me to be part of a system where we all mutually agree to avoid that pain. And that doesn't require supernatural grounding. It just requires scientifically demonstrable levels of empathy and pro-social behavior. And then that leads to because I'm a lawyer, I lead to a real critique of the system, right? Because the legal system should be based on sound science. And yet we have a legal system that pretends that educational systems are sufficient when children show up in school 4 or 5 years of age, when the science tells us that they are developing or losing the capacity to develop empathy and pro-social behavior years 0 to 3. So, I think if we're looking for a system of ethics, how to live our lives amongst each other socially, we should ground it on science because that is the sufficiently objective basis. And it has an application in things like education policy. Our current education policy ignores the fact that the true social education that children require happens in their infancy and not in the classroom. So, I think we can use science to improve our system of ethics, like law, by fixing, either it's a fallacious bit of science or it's a misapplication. In this case, a misapplication. We know that early childhood development will control empathy and pro-social behavior, but we don't apply it in early childhood development context. We wait until classrooms, which is nonsense.
Yeah. It's another great example. And that second question, what matters morally, there are some who will challenge people like you and me who have a naturalistic worldview if they come from a supernatural place, because they are so used to having some form of external reference. There is a deity that is the perfect instantiation of the good. Good and bad are often defined as compliance with their wishes or a list of rules that you might find in a book. So in a sense, I would argue that those ethical codes are just as arbitrary as any fabrication, but they feel emotionally reassuring because there's a book and there's a list and there's a social structure that does this stuff. So they feel like they've got something solid. So they will quite often turn to someone with a naturalistic worldview and say, well, what have you got, right? There are just facts about the world, and science uncovers an understanding of those things. How can you ever get to values, and how can you ever get to ethics? And you've hinted already at your answer in a sense, but because you've talked about how just a scientific understanding of what it means to be a human or a sentient animal demonstrates to us their capacity to suffer and to flourish. My personal answer to that is to say, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure you don't either. And morality is just my choice to care about that. So would you round out any further your sense of, what the grounding for your ethics is in a naturalistic context?
Yeah, and I think, I think one way to do it is sort of a contractualist approach, which is we are all subject to the influence of other people. If you could come up with rules that would structure that influence, what would those rules look like? And I think pushed to consider and explain their answers, most people would say, well, I would want a system whereby I would have to consent to the influence of other people. I wouldn't want to be secretly brainwashed as a child. I wouldn't want to be subject to violence against my will. I wouldn't want to be surveilled so that Google could know how to sell me products without my knowing about it. I would want to consent to those forms of influence. That alone, that one rule, I'd like to consent, would be sufficient to derive several norms that would structure our behavior. And so I think it's easy to go from a fact like I can consent to influence, or there are ways that my consent can be evaded. That's a fact. To a value that I value being able to consent to, a norm like let's structure a rule whereby we can consent. That's our attempt at fair start, as a rule that maximizes consent. So I think we can move from fact to value to norm fairly easily. It's without considering making the naturalistic fallacy. We don't make that mistake.
And that's one of the frustrations I have with, because I put naturalism at the center of this idea as I guess a methodological naturalism, the use of evidence and reason with humility to form beliefs and credences about the world. And that's obviously distinct from the naturalistic fallacy, which is thinking that the natural, whatever it is by definition good. And that clearly is something, I think is a bleak and awful vision, given some of the things that we see in nature. So I completely agree, but that's one of the unfortunate things about this, the terminological link between a naturalistic fallacy, which I think is awful, and naturalism, which is as an understanding of, developing understanding of the world. But yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, and I think it means an example of what a naturalistic fallacy would be, as opposed to the sort of three steps that I think don't reflect the fallacy. For example, I had said, well, child-centric family planning has a lot of benefits. We can share resources before the children even arrive to level playing field. For example, some conditions in which children will be born and raised in their first year could result in significant trauma, whether it's dehydration, starvation, other things, right? So we can prevent children from being born in those circumstances through planning. Someone had said, well, show me an example in the history of the world where any society adopted a collective child-centric perspective. And that to me was the naturalistic fallacy, right? So that the norm of living that way would depend on some evidence that we had done it in the past. Maybe they were suggesting, well, it's infeasible and it's less, my argument for infeasibility may depend on whether there are examples of the past. But what I think the person was trying to say is, we can't structure a system without it having been that case. To me, that was sort of like trying to require this is to move to the ought. So that to me looked like a naturalistic fallacy.
Agree. Yeah, it's a good example. And if we were really to follow, an evolutionary drive as an ethical imperative, we should be spending all day donating sperm in the sperm bank, right? And it doesn't take much to see the problems of taking a sort of descriptive view of how things have come to be and taking that as a positive norm. It's to me a glaringly obvious fallacy, but also extremely common. Yeah. So that's fascinating. And you've talked about suffering, you've talked about flourishing, but you've talked about autonomy and consent as well. And I find the interrelationship between those things important, because my personal view is that everything ultimately comes back to sentient experiences. It comes back to suffering and flourishing. So the reason I care about freedom and autonomy is because of their impact on suffering and flourishing. So generally, we enjoy being free. We don't like being constrained. So, that's why. Other people will see suffering and flourishing and freedom and autonomy as sort of independent ethical foundations. They're both important independently. So freedom is important, even if it has no impact on your experiences, your suffering and flourishing, it's independently important. And others will go the other way and say, actually, freedom and autonomy is the most important thing. It's even more important than suffering and flourishing. How do you think of those concepts in your ethical worldview? Are they one above the other, or in parallel, or some other formulation?
With Fair Start, our goal in some ways is to define optimal world populations. And we use that plural because what we would be looking at would be disparate groups of people like nation states, and what those populations would look like qualitatively, not quantitatively. We want to depart thinking about people as numbers and start thinking about it qualitatively. And one way you could achieve, one method for coming to optimal world populations would be to say, let's try to maximize relative self-determination. So you want to start with something like 0, like nature. And as groups form and grow, as you add people, people's relative self-determination gives way to the group. You're being determined by others. You no longer have, if you had one person in a group, you might have, absolute self-determination. You add people, it becomes relatively less as the group grows. At some point, you don't want the group to grow anymore. You want to subdivide so that you can maintain your role in the group, your relative self-determination. In that feeling of self-determination, the capability of participating in a group, in my mind, that concept holds within it welfare, equity, nature. Probably, we don't have to get into it, but this idea you want your life to continue and improve, that is what justifies having children, by our view. But really nature, equity, welfare, democracy, and then this idea of improved continuity. So I think I probably side with the latter camp that you described, in that we prioritize a singular value of relative self-determination, which really could be the same thing as consent or freedom, and to enable people to be in a position to do that, to show up in the town hall in a way where you are free and equal, or Philip Pettit describes it as being able to look someone else in the eye as an equal. You're not going to look at a celebrity and have a position of deference because you're subject to celebritism. That to be in that position requires levels of welfare, levels of equity, levels of participatory democracy, and levels of an ecological surrounding that allows you to flourish. And then this concept that we populate the world, we're doing it to continue our lives and improve them. Those values will occupy this idea of relative self-determination. So it prioritizes freedom.
Yeah, thank you.
And makes welfare part of it.
And I can see these terms and concepts get quite tightly linked together, and there's almost like feedback loops behind them. But I think part of the reason why the idea of autonomy and freedom is so attractive is because, in a way, if you're thinking about an individual sentient being, they probably are the best placed to judge their own suffering and their own flourishing, their own well-being, rather than us judging from outside. And they are probably, on average, also quite well placed to decide what to do to make things better for them. So there's a sort of inbuilt bias towards freedom, because the individual often should be in the best place to decide how to flourish and avoid suffering. I guess at the same time, particularly when we're thinking about, living in cooperation and communication, that's where you do need to impose limits to that freedom, because the freedom to needlessly harm others, for example, there you get into complex issues. And I think that's one place where having freedom as an ultimate doesn't necessarily help. Well, I guess it does, because you're trading off competing freedoms. But I think there is also a concept of needless suffering or enabling flourishing that helps us judge what those limits to freedom should be. So I'm not pretending it's a simple thing, I guess, but yeah.
No, I agree. And I think, so in some ways, I'll say a negative about this approach and then a positive. In some ways, our approach is reactionary, because Fair Start was a reaction to a clear mistake. And the mistake was viewing the act of creating other people, of having children, as an act of self-determination for the parents, when in fact it's very much an act of other determination for the children born. That mistake is a mistake of it's a conceptual area of misunderstanding freedom. Same mistake one makes when you refuse to wear a mask in the middle of a pandemic. Same mistake one makes when you refuse to vaccinate in the pandemic, where you have this idea that freedom means you can do whatever you want. In fact, freedom is what we said it is. It's a capacity to live in a town hall setting where you are relatively self-determining, and that depends on welfare, equity, nature, and your role in democracy in that town hall.
Yeah, it's not freedom to do whatever you like, regardless of consequences to others. Yeah,
freedom really is recognizing the social structure that you're in and determining whether or not you are relatively self-determining in that social structure. There's all of the sort of fallacious ideas of freedom, free market economics, ignore what's the town hall that regulates your free market system. No economist has ever thought you could have a system that didn't assign things like basic property rights. Well, how did you determine those property rights? What was the town hall that existed prior to your shopping mall? And it's the mistake. It's really missing that freedom is a little more complex. It involves capacity to interact with others in a relatively self-determining way. So invocations of freedom, I guess I'm into the positive aspect of it now. The negative is that we created Fair Start as a reaction to misunderstandings about freedom, and a very specific reaction that the idea of creating children was self-determining for the parents. And we've moved to try to evolve people's understanding that to be free first, it may later involve subjective choice, but it first involves your capacity to be in a social situation where you're then enabled to do that relative to other people in a relatively self-determining way. And so that ensuring that capacity is contingent on the creation of people. We cannot create a town hall without determining who is in the town hall. And that mostly determines, given early childhood development, mostly is determined by our creation or population growth. So it really, I think we lie on a bedrock of freedom as our core value. I think it does in some ways encompass sentience and flourishing. It just uses traditional social contract terminology. And I don't know that it conceptually, I think it could certainly encompass sentience and flourishing, but it uses more traditional social contract theory.
Yeah, thank you. Makes sense. So the second part of this, what matters and who matters question is one of moral scope. And this is an interesting question almost regardless of your ethical system. So whether you have a contractual approach or a feminist care ethic or a deontological approach or a utilitarian approach, or a virtue ethics approach, at some point you still have to decide who gets to count in our moral consideration. So that would be another question that would be interesting to dig into for you about how you've gone through that journey of setting moral scope and where you've got to now. And the clue is in the name with Sentientism. That's really the question it focuses on. It says you can use whatever ethical system you like, but we have to include all sentient beings in our moral consideration as we work out what the right things to do are. And clearly the sort of human to non-human boundary is a really difficult one for most people to cross. So it'd be interesting to know your journey on thinking about moral scope and who gets to count. And again, you can dig back into your childhood and tell us the story of how your thinking has developed.
I think, and the initial thinking was very much simply looking at the civil rights movement as a movement to correct bad thinking and untruth about different races and their place in the world. And then it's, sort of in the light of that revelation, you look at non-humans' position and you begin to look to, question those distinctions.
So you got to, I guess, a sort of universal human view quite quickly. It sounds like that was the water you were swimming in, the way your family grew up and thought. That came quite quickly. How quickly did you move into thinking about the non-human? Because that's a step that almost nobody ever takes in a real sense. People they'll engage with companion animals, or they'll care about some selected charismatic wildlife. But seriously thinking more broadly, how did that process happen for you? Was it early or?
It was in college. I started reading literature from PETA, and I think PETA did a great job of eliciting your emotional reaction to the suffering you were seeing, and then tying that to some action to eliminate that suffering. So it was really, sort of utilitarian Singer's approach of trying to minimize demonstrable suffering, in some ways as if it were an element in the world, or like a currency in the world, kind of irrespective of who was doing the suffering. And that tied, sort of again tied to Nagel's explanation of sort of getting to ethics from simply the recognition of something like suffering in another person, which of course makes total sense. Like, you need the capacity to recognize that suffering to be social. I think it in some ways it moved to a very straightforward focus just on humans without the non-human element, because I realized that the debate about animal protection still remains controversial, but the debate about human rights and human freedom is not so controversial. I think most people would be willing to accept that we should try to maximize human freedom. And then the obvious opportunity, which is, well, you maximize human freedom by restoring nature with a non-human world, the standard that would have prevented the climate crisis if we'd not entered the Anthropocene. We would all be better. We would all be free from the influence of Exxon. And guess what? The consequence of that is that non-humans are free as well. We've restored non-human habitat biodiversity. They live their own autonomous lives. So we don't even need to get to animal rights or animal protection or controversial subjects. We just have to think, how do we restore the non-human world in a way that maximizes human freedom? And that's where Fair Start came from. It's very simple.
Yeah. And you can win on both fronts. And was that a difficult transition to, I guess, take the implications of non-human ethics seriously? Because some people will, they'll read the PETA materials, they might read some Peter Singer, but the social norms still stop them from making personal changes or really driving through, and they'll just sort of go back into a denial and say, well, that was a sort of interesting perspective, but I'm just going to not think about it. And frankly, that's what I did for many decades, right? Or was it more of a light bulb moment where you were like, no, this is it, I'm going to make some changes in my life and drive it through regardless of the social context?
Yeah, it was a light bulb moment because, to the extent that it derived from seeing a lot of bad thinking and a lot of untruth, I then had a really skeptical view of a lot of the accepted norms and thinking. And so, for example, your reaction to a lot of people's reaction to PETA might have been, well, this is true, these animals are suffering, but it's necessary for the advancement of science. But I knew already the advancement of science was already responsible for the massive degradation of our ecology, which is not good for humans. So, you taking the idea that we need to advance science at face value, if you're referring to making more consumer goods for more people, that's actually going to hurt humans in the end. That's not a value. So I think once you learned that the position of non-humans and the position of other races was subject to untruth to preserve power structures at the top, I found it very easy to question the explanations for, well, I think there was a lot of recent science about University of Wisconsin doing experiments on infant primates in order to discover antidepressants for children. When any childhood development specialist worth their while would have told you needed to change the conditions in which the children are living to improve them, not to medicate them immediately. And then you realize, the entire scientific protocol was designed to pay the researchers in charge, had nothing to do with creating social utility. So yeah, it wasn't hard to move from that.
Yeah. That sort of skeptical mindset already had you Well primed. Yeah. Thank you. And I guess what sentientism suggests is that we should extend our moral consideration based on sentience, the capacity to suffer and to flourish. And in it doesn't tell us which entities are sentient. It just says, look, follow a naturalistic approach and prudently try and work it out. So my sense of scientific consensus at the moment is that essentially talking about animals is a pretty good analog, right? There might be some of the very simplest animals. Sea sponges don't have a nervous system at all. Maybe some of the other very simple invertebrates maybe are not sentient or less sentient, but generally animals is a good sort of shortcut, which is why, in a sense, it has such a strong overlap with veganism, in that veganism is primarily motivated by trying to avoid needlessly causing suffering and death, and only sentient beings have the capacity to suffer. So it's a reasonable overlap. But there are some people who will criticize sentientism and say, look, we need to go beyond that because rocks and rivers and trees and ecosystems and habitats matter too. And personally, I'm quite strict about the sentientism thing. So I will say, look, the ecosystem matters deeply. I totally agree, but it matters because of the impact it has on the sentient beings. It doesn't intrinsically matter in the same way as a sentient being that can actually experience its own suffering. But other people will prefer to intrinsically, if you like, grant rights to rocks and rivers and mountains and say, no, those things matter independently, even if there were no sentient beings here at all. What's your sense about going beyond sentience in terms of moral scope?
I mean, it's very practical, and that is simply applying the precautionary principle, which is, so, let's be clear. We thought certain things about, non-humans. Those things were wrong. And we agree that the treatment of those non-humans as a result was wrong. For example, great apes. Scientific consensus regarding the treatment of great apes, chimpanzees today, is virtually they are to be treated as humans because we cannot distinguish the experiences that they would suffer from our experiences. So given that we were wrong, we should proceed very cautiously when we do things that impact other entities, whether they're sentient or not. And really I think the precautionary principle requires scientists to show that they are not impacting a sentient entity through things that they're doing. And in some ways, the question is purely theoretical because the actual behavior of humans is overrunning these other entities without us having determined what their capacities are. So I think as a matter, I think the first order of business now is to stop the spread of the Anthropocene, reverse it, and we can sit from a position of safety to engage in the precautionary principle. Because the excuse for the overrun now is that somehow there's some social utility created because market value reflects that utility, but it's utter nonsense. Methamphetamine is quite valuable on the open market. That doesn't mean that methamphetamine is actually valuable, but the market tells us it's very valuable. So it gives you an idea of how helpful market thinking is.
Yeah. And one of the other areas of moral scope that's interesting is to do with very young humans, children, for example, and that feeds directly into your work. There's an interesting analog between very young humans and non-humans, because in a sense, most people will agree that they have the capacity to suffer. And most people will agree, despite the existence of animal farming, that suffering is morally salient and is a negative thing and we should not needlessly cause it. Like I say, that's partly why I really don't understand how animal farming still exists today, but let's put that to one side for the moment. But there's an interesting analog there because that suffering people understand, young children, babies even, have the capacity to suffer. That suffering matters, just like with a non-human animal. And also just with a non-human animal, the capacities don't exist for very young humans to fully, in a mature way, represent their interests and their needs. In the same way as a non-human animal might struggle. Quite often they do have a voice and they do call out and they do react, but we might ignore them or we might deprecate them or we might misinterpret. But when you're thinking about young humans, I think we can sort of take for granted that people understand that their moral patience and their suffering and their flourishing matters. But your work has been interesting because it seems like you've shifted your thinking about their agency and their autonomy and how we should think about them. So how did you go through that process of thinking differently about children?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great philosopher named Joel Feinberg who really was maybe the first to really in I would say post like 1950, start to think about non-humans and young children in the same way as uniquely vulnerable populations. It only also occurred to me that there's a little like an order error in thinking. So we could lay out all vulnerable entities and think, how can we prevent their suffering? We look at non-humans and we look at children. But from what social organization are we proceeding? What is the social organization that we're in when we make the inquiry about how to minimize suffering? And what we have is universal agreement that the children born into my social organization, into my country or into my nation state or into my township, that they will share part of the democratic process with me. They'll be part of the constitutional convention. So I think we first have to consider, what role do our actions with regard to young children play in determining that social contract, so that we can sit in a justified political organization and then ask these questions about what we owe other entities. We have to first justify our social organization. So to me, that makes perfect sense. We should be ensuring the development of all children in a way that makes them part of a functional town hall. That's sort of first order of business. And my fear is that animal rights advocates completely missed that point, because while Peter Singer and Tom Reagan and other folks were focusing on what we owe animals, we were never doing what it took to ensure the democratic development of children. And now we are where we are in the world today: mass extinction, mass Anthropocene in the form of the climate crisis, degrading democracies, which mean we don't even have functional political systems to deal with the climate crisis. So in some ways, we're looking off in the distance at these other entities, but it was us. It was our social organizations that we really should have been mindful of. Bottom line is, I think the most effective animal rights advocates would have, in the middle of the 20th century, thought about creating small functional democracies as the best way to help animals, not theoretically what we would owe them. And so I'm now, I think the main thing with Fair Start is people would say it's 50 years too late, trying to now pivot to focus on making children empathetic, pro-social, capable of a system that can regard other animals and then make determinations about what we owe them. So I want to start with children and get to animals, not look at animals while children overrun them, because we've missed the order.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. And I guess that seamlessly brings us into this final question about how to make the world a better place. And it strikes me that some people who have a more expansive moral scope, care about all sentient animals and maybe even care about ecosystems and so on, will then diffuse the focus on humans, because we are just one part of a broader ecosystem, and we should just be more humble and continue playing our role, and that's it. And I can sort of see the attraction for that, but I think there's a problem with it. Others will almost turn to a very negative view of humans as a pernicious influence on the world and on the ecosystems. The trope is humanity is the virus, we're the invasive species. And they'll develop an extremely negative view about the human species, which can take you into eco-fascism or extreme versions of antinatalism, where they think it would be better if we just didn't exist at all and then let the ecosystem continue. But there's another philosophy and another approach, which I think yours is more aligned with, which is recognizing that, yes, physically, maybe we're a small part of what goes on the planet, but we're super important, whether we like it or not, because of our capabilities and our power. And we are sentient beings, so we matter in our own right too. So I like that focus on recognizing that, if you want to find the levers of power, you probably need to focus on us as humans, and we're better to focus than on an enabling and empowering perspective for young children too. But there's part of a difficulty, because I think I sometimes have maybe a naive view of how we start off as children, and I shouldn't overplay this, because we're not born as perfect ethical beings and then we're warped by society. I think that's naive, right? There are small children who will pull the wings off insects, and there's cruelty in our makeup as well, of course, right? We're not, but at the same time, I do think that the default young child, one, is quite naturalistic in their epistemology, right? That we're exploring, we're using our senses. We're trying to understand things. Of course, biases creep in, right? But it's a fairly honest attempt to understand the world. But then as society picks us up and develops us, we are told fabrications and given social norms that cause harm. And on the moral scope side, it seems similar too, because I think most children do have an intuitive sense of compassion for other beings they think are living and sentient. So if you put a small child with a pig and a puppy, they probably won't want to hurt either of them. But again, later on, they are told through a process of indoctrination that it's completely normal to pay to have other sentient beings killed for your pleasure. So, it's this oversimplistic view of a pure childhood that is then warped by social norms. But many people, if I lay that picture out, or many people who, for example, live in a, maybe a religious worldview that they provides social structure and norms and ethics, and a worldview that sees, for example, animal agriculture as a completely normal and natural and traditional part of what they're doing. They might actually use your terminology and say, what we're doing is bringing these children into the town hall, and they wouldn't say indoctrinating, right? They would say, encouraging them to adopt these norms that we think are positive, and then off we go. So what's the problem? So I guess that's the challenge, is there's that process of democracy and social connection and negotiation and town halls. But how do we think about the values that are imbued through that process? And I guess that's the core of what you're trying to focus on.
Yeah. And honestly, I think just in some ways, the creation of people into the town hall is so far from making it functional that just moving it to giving people the capacity for democratic relative self-determination itself would resolve a lot of these questions about norms. For example, ensuring that people were raised in conditions where they could trust one another, right? Maybe there's not rampant crime because there's not rampant inequity. Well, if there's trust, maybe people would think there's not some grand scheme in the vaccination process to poison all of us. It's not that we need to delve into the science about whether vaccines are poison or not. The question is whether we trust each other. And that depends on our fundamental social relations, which depend on our creation. So I think we can probably resolve a lot of the questions just by making the fundamental power structure and the way we create that structure more just, without having to delve into the other questions. And I would want to address one thing you said. I think it's purely naturalistic fallacy to say, that humans are a small part of a grand scheme. That's a statement, that's an is. How did they get to the ought that we should then ignore humans' power relations with each other? Doesn't make any sense. That person wouldn't think that as they're being, knifed in an alley by someone. They would want to have avoided that structure that led to that. And I don't have a pernicious view that humans are a virus. It's very simple. There is an optimal world population for humans that's qualitative, that reflects investment in people, welfare, equity, the restoration of nature. And we can get to that optimality. I think Chris Tucker's book, he sort of puts it at about 3.1, but he's got a great perspective on this. That I think that getting to that point doesn't require thinking about humans as a virus or thinking about a spiritual view that we consider these things. It's simply like any other species. Our species has to fit into the ecosystem. And there's a way to think about that's qualitative and not quantitative. And I think that's what Fair Start attempts to do. So I think we reject the pernicious view, we reject the sort of grand spiritual view, and it's simply a matter of recognizing that, like any other species, we were prone to ignore the limits of our but we did so at our own peril. Unfortunately, the climate crisis may mean that we've created potentially irreversible feedback loop. But if we haven't, if there's a way to restore optimality, then it's the first order of business, because we are before we do.
Yeah.
And that's it.
So one of the counters to that view, I guess there's a couple of themes. One is, I guess, a sort of techno-optimism that says that, when we look at the scale of the world and you look at the population of beings on it, even if you just looked at farmed animals, we kill 100 billion maybe land animals per year, and then maybe a couple of trillion fish. So in that context, us as humans are quite a small number of living sentient beings. So in a way, our impact isn't because of the number of human population, it's because of the, what we do in the world. So for example, if we, just transition to a vegan world and we go down the full renewable energy path and we find other ways of moderating our impact through technology and through innovation and frankly through better ethics like eating plants instead of animals, wouldn't that enable us to continue on our current default path of population? So one is can we improve the carrying capacity of the earth through moderating our behavior and through technology? There's another stronger view which actually says maybe we need more people, right? But you need more people to drive economic growth, and we need all of those brains working, and we need a sort of abundance mentality and so on. So there are different flavors and different extremes there, of course. But how do you respond to those challenges of an alternative path forward?
Yeah, this is in some ways why we created the Fair Start question, is if you looked at people's lives, and I want to be careful, I'm not deriving, some norm from just looking at how people behave, but I think you would find that autonomy, freedom, self-determination is probably something that a lot of people value. It explains the rise of free market economics over social systems. It explains a lot about our world today. People in the latter camp that you mentioned, total utilitarians, they cannot account for how their system ensures relative self-determination of those people. They'll dump as many people into as many systems as exist in the hopes that there might be some genius born to solve the problem that the dumping created.
Without regard for all of the others who are continuing to suffer. And
those people are fuel for a system to produce an outcome that the system itself can't democratically decide is even a good outcome, because there's so many people, nobody is as sufficient role to participate. We have something called the paradox of democracy, paradox of voting, which is at a certain point it's irrational to vote because you play so little role. And so it's a complete disregard for the idea of human autonomy and freedom. It's using people to try to be born, to try to achieve certain outcomes. And I can assure you, none of the total utilitarians would want their children born in the conditions that their total utility allows children to be born into. In the first camp, I think it's easy to disprove this argument that technology is the solution, which is the technology might be the solution, they would argue, to the fossil fuel driven climate crisis. Fossil fuel development and use was itself a technological solution to many crises in the past. But because we didn't have Fair Start, but because we weren't making children for town halls, instead we were making them for shopping malls, the process by which we developed the fossil fuel industry was not subject to democratic decision making. Those companies ran amok in places like the United States as clear evidence that they did things to ensure, for example, the proliferation of highways, the use of automobiles over community building structures where we would use communal rail systems or other things that actually built communities, that kept communities intact. They exploded communities through undemocratic processes and the influence that they had over legislatures to create a mass highway system that tore communities apart. And so the argument is, well, we can solve this problem with technology. This problem was created with a technology that only existed and proliferated because we didn't have functional democracies. So no, the first order of business is to create functional democracies because I want to be self-determining. And then we can decide as a group whether a particular technology is actually creating social utility or not. My guess is if we had been that way, we would not have thought that mass extraction of fossil fuels was a good idea, because it would simply destroy our communities by creating a massive highway system that only benefited some to the cost of those communities, and we wouldn't be in the climate crisis.
And the climate change impact has been known about since the 1800s as well. It's not like we've only just worked this out, is it? So,
yeah, I mean, the question is not whether we should have new technologies. The question is whether the people that made money on these technologies that created the crisis owe future generations for the harm they caused. The answer is yes. And the answer is how we will take that money from them, because they owe it. And redistribution of the wealth that was taken without paying the costs that it was imposing on others, primarily the future generation, that was a wrong. And the real question is how we right that wrong. And I think the movement for climate reparations, the movement for climate justice, that's the real question. Forget technology. The money that thinks that's going to make more money by creating new technologies. That money is subject to claims by people who will take it on behalf of future generations. I think that's the real question.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. So one of the other challenges, I guess, is if we do think that there is, a target world population of maybe 4 to 6 billion that is in the right sort of range in terms of, our future flourishing and the structure of democracy and freedom and autonomy and suffering and everything else, as well as the continuation of the planet. We're at, I think, 7.98 billion now, and the default projections are that we would, I think, by the end of the century, get to something like 11 billion. And then, as I understand it, who knows, right? Because population modeling there are many various paths, but it feels like it may actually, at that point, around 11 billion, actually flatten off and stabilize and continue on. Who knows, right? If we are going to change that path and move it towards something that looks more like 4, 5, 6 billion, an intuitive response to that is, well, the only time that sort of population decrease has ever happened before are through terrible, terrible things, right? Famine, war, pestilence, plague. I guess so. One, there's a question about feasibility, but it links into another question I hinted at earlier on, which is population ethics is a very difficult space. I think it's super important. But one of the reasons it's so taboo is because there are some very, very dark paths that some people end up following when they think these things through. So how do we avoid those dark paths and those ethical routes that end up saying, look, the problem for the planet is so big that we need a substantial reduction in human population. And yes, I am willing to advocate some awfully unethical things done to humans and human populations and freedom and suffering, but we need to get there for the benefit of the planet. How do we avoid that path? And is there an alternative that is still ethical to the humans that are on the planet today, but gets to a more sustainable population, in your view?
Yeah, no, that's the crux. And I think, first, we have to recognize that a system that would accept that it could go to 11, 12, some project 14, or we could go this other way. These are just things that might happen. This is the UN saying that these might happen. That's insane. What they're saying is children might be born in abject poverty. There might be massive inequality. We might have an open multiplier that whatever our impacts, whatever our technology is, we're going to multiply it by 12 billion people. That's completely inconsistent with the UN's mandate to assure that those things don't happen. So I'll just start with that perspective.
I guess the challenge would be, but if you look at things like child mortality and poverty, we have made substantial progress against that. Maybe that progress curve can offset the population growth as opposed to just expanding the problems. But
I think that's true. But relative to the option of ensuring children are born in conditions that respect the Children's Rights Convention, I think you get a much better impact headed towards 7 or 8 by 2100, for example, than you do headed towards 12 or 13. I think the reason that they're leaving that variable open is because of economic growth model, because nation states want to continue to use children to build economic growth. It's not building value.
Humans as a resource, as a labor resource, right? Yeah.
That's Julian Simon. Wonderful addition to Ethics of the World is to basically create a system of exploitation of the most vulnerable entities, children. I mean, that philosophy leads to children being born in horrific circumstances, not something he would have ever wanted to experience. So it's a great example of lack of pro-social behavior. I think so. The question you ask is like, how would we get there? And I think the answer is pretty straightforward in our view, and that is you have to require equity for children. So you have got to redistribute resources to ensure that we have poor children who generally become poor adults and rich children who generally become rich adults. You have to level the playing field. This could be as simple as eliminating all tax benefits for wealthy parents, quadrupling those benefits for poorer parents. And I think what you're trying to do is level social equity. And there's nobody, I don't think anyone who thinks they are advocating social justice that shouldn't want that equity. Now that creates, that distribution of wealth creates an opportunity to create another form of equity, which is a ecological form of equity, because when you're redistributing that money, you can do it in a way that could incentivize smaller families for everyone. And you could incentivize smaller families. You could also incentivize delay. Same thing. You get to a smaller family when you incentivize delay. The delay could be more for women's autonomy, right? They're not going to live in a culture where they're treated as a mother in waiting when they're 18 years old, right? They're given the autonomy through an incentive because there's a delay, or we have an incentive that does talk about smaller families, but it's universal. There's ecological equity there, because no, it's not fair that people 30, 40, 50 years ago were born in conditions where children were not having fetal heart defects because of the climate crisis, which happens at 1 degree centigrade rise. That's unfair. Children should not be experiencing those things. So we, in fact, by reducing family size and shooting for the lower curve that the UN should be shooting for, we're reducing long-term emissions, mitigating the climate crisis, and that's ecological equity. Children should have the natural environment that prior generations were thriving in, and we can do that by changing the way we plan families.
So it feels to me that the mindset shift you're pushing for is to say it's not explicitly about population targets. It's more about saying, as we, for example, as parents decide whether or not to bring children into the world, we should have a reasonable view that they're going to have a good life, right?
And you have to do that collectively. There's no way to do that without doing it in a collective way, which is the opposite of what we do today.
And I think this is where there's another interesting angle there, because there's a sense in which people might push back on your initiative and the ideas to say, look, you talk about freedom, but surely parents should have the freedom to have children and grow a family as big as they like. But interestingly, again, this is looking backwards, the more you empower, particularly women, and the better you educate, and the more developed an economy and living circumstances are, the less children people have anyway. So there, it does feel like there is a positive balance here, whereby you can sort of do both at once and sort of square the circle. And actually, it's quite often, and Nandita, who introduced us in the first place, a previous guest, laid that out really nicely by saying, look, there's such a strong social norm driven by that economic argument. We need lots of population, driven by sometimes a military argument. We need lots of people and a big population to dominate and to win, or driven by sometimes a religious argument. We need more Christians, we need more Muslims, we need more whatever we are, right, to go forth and multiply and to increase our numbers. And those sort of social norms, even in the secular context, are so powerful that actually maybe we can make a radical change just by moving towards a more rational, compassionate way of thinking about it. And is this too naive, right? Do you think that we could get to a point where purely by empowerment and more sharing and more equity, and we could still allow parents to take completely independent decisions in that context and get to where you want to go? Or do you think when you talk about a collective decision, is there rationale for there to be some more constraint or control there that again can be ethically difficult?
Yeah, and I guess I start from just a principle that the idea that parents creating another person can be done independently you're skirting with a major fallacy there. You're creating another person. There's no such thing as procreative autonomy. That's a contradiction in terms. There is procreative justice, and that requires a collective system. It doesn't, I think the forces of growth have created this specter of the state coming in to influence decision-making. But all we're saying is, how do we get to a future where there are functional town halls where people can actually be in a capacity to be free? Not the freedom to do whatever you want, which doesn't make any sense, but the freedom to be in that capacity. How do we create that for our children in the future so that they can play a role in their own self-determination? And so I guess I'm not as hopeful that simply encouraging autonomy will do that, because even if we have smaller families, lower fertility rates, that doesn't address the question of children being born into horrific circumstances, doesn't address the question of the distinction between rich kids and poor kids, and they'll end up in those socioeconomic positions statistically as they get older. It doesn't address how falling fertility rates actually restore non-human worlds, so non-human autonomy. We might, get to a position where we've mitigated the climate crisis, but restorative environmentalism wants to do a lot more than that. We want to dial down to 280 or less ppm and restore the world to the way prior generations have it. So I think it would require a radical change, like moving from parental subjective standards to child objective standards to do that. But this is the point. If we're not willing to give children what they need, I'm not sure we're in a position to be parenting in the first place. We would not want to be born into conditions that weren't set by a rule designed to give children what they need. So we should extend that to future children. Nandita can probably show greater impact because she rides the wave of autonomy, and women want the autonomy as well of not having. But when it comes to the decision of having, I can't see autonomy being a solution because the act of creating is inherently interpersonal. It's not personal. We have to start with the recognition of that truth. In some way, it's naturalistic. This is the science, right? The science showed us that non-humans have desire for autonomous lives like ours. Chimpanzees, we know it. We'll get there when it comes to bovine. Science logic shows that the act of creating a person is interpersonal. It's inherently collective. So we have to start from that.
And this is where I guess this, like any ethical topic, it gets difficult when there are, different perspectives. You've got to contrast in different sets of interests. And to my mind, I think it's extremely important to recognize the potential perspective of a potential future child, and to imagine their life and to think what their life would be like, and to give that moral weight, and in the consideration. And I maybe naively would just hope that we can find a way collectively of helping individuals see that view, appreciate that view, and take their own decisions. I guess where I get extremely nervous is where we are going to a collective place, which then constrains individuals. And whether that's just a naive view from me that I hope we could just, all think and be ethical and the world will be a better place, and whether I'm just, underestimating the problem or being too hesitant about some form of, going back to the Chinese one-child policy and enforcing that, I guess that's where I get nervous, and I'm sort of hopeful there's a different path. But
I think there's an analogy here to free speech. I think that people don't necessarily feel like there's a spectral government, this dark force overseeing their free speech necessarily. Obviously, in places that there's no free speech, that's the case. But in places where people feel like, oh, I'm in a system that respects free speech, they feel like that. But they're not. They are absolutely moderating their behavior because most people have an internal sense that there are limits on free speech. They don't yell fire in a theater. They don't intentionally defame people without thinking there'll be legal consequences. So there are limits that people inherently recognize. I'd love for our system of having children to get to that level of development in terms of the right that we inherently interpret. There are limits to this right. The problem is that the UN and states have imposed this concept of procreative autonomy, because if they'd interpreted the right correctly, which we think is fair start, 1948 was probably the most opportune chance to do that in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the chance where nation states were actually willing to give up some of their sovereignty. But the governments and the UN at the time saw growth as an opportunity, and they exploited it. Julian Simon types put us in this position. And so, what I would say is if in 1948 we'd started educating people about the inherent logic of having children and the limits that logic imposes, we'd be in a good position. Doing it in 2022 is much more challenging, but I don't think we should ignore the truth that there are inherent limits to the right. People can be taught those limits, and it doesn't require the overarching government. What it does require is nudges like tax policy, educational systems where children speak out about what they want the future to look like, and how are we going to have population policies that lead to that future? So I think fairstartmovement.org lists dozens of interventions in our Take Action page that don't look like the jackbooted state coming in. And what those interventions do is actually ensure freedom. Parents whose children are seized by the state because they neglected or abused them, they're not free, and nor are their kids. children born into poverty, they're going to work for some rich children in the future. They're not free either. And none of us are free by a open multiplier that will continue to degrade the ecology. So what we're talking about is maximizing freedom, much the way masks and vaccines maximize freedom. We're going to do the same thing when it comes to having children. The real question is we're pushing against a tide of growth that was created by the UN and nation states that wanted to exploit people. As you said, people are a resource, and that is the opposition we have to overcome.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a fascinating topic. It's often a really difficult one. So yeah, I appreciate your work, thinking through it honestly and with integrity. And I think a view that is thinking about better lives, not just more lives, and that is looking for win-win-wins across the human, the non-human, and the environment space, it has to be the way we go. And I guess I just hope that we're not too late to be able to follow a path where, through education and empowerment and sharing in community, we can find that better outcome rather than having to get too draconian. But let's see where we go. So yeah.
That sounds great, Jamie. And I really appreciated being with you today. I value your work immensely. The world's a better place for you doing this work. And I'll just end by saying, a lot of people say, well, this is abstract or nothing too specific. And I always end by just simply saying, look at Japan. We have a really great example of what it looks like for a country to be going true demographic transition, negative fertility rates, sub-replacement, and doing better than countries who are in the tumult of unsustainable growth. It's not abstract. This is something we can do and we have to do to follow the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's what will impact non-humans the most. So thank you for creating a forum to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And one more quick thing just before we wrap up. Is it naive to say that thinking more intelligently about future population could also improve the way we think about migration and immigration?
100%. It's not naive at all.
Yeah, because that's my simple answer to the countries that are seeing population growth slowing. Is there are a lot of great people who really need jobs and will pay taxes and will come and enliven your communities. How do you? Is that too naive that there's a positive relation?
I think it's absolutely. I mean, our position is really straightforward. If we think that the freedom to travel, to migrate, to associate is a human right, freedom to move and associate with whom you want, you have to imagine the people capable of such a thing, and imagine the quantities, qualities, and relative position to each other of those people. And then you create that world. And then people can do that. I don't think you're going to think that world exists the way we're creating people now, just dumping them into a system so we can exploit them for economic growth. You're going to have to create smaller populations of people capable of a borderless world where we trust each other enough to live that way. So I do think that thinking about future population is a great way to address some of the concerns about immigration today. I think your point's more practical, which is, to the extent that people are worried about losing their economic growth, immigration is a great way to solve that. But I question people: is economic growth the imperative, or is creating systems of town halls where people can actually self-regulate? Is that the imperative?
And I think that's partly it, because you might think of it in an economic sense. We more workers, more taxpayers, but you can also think migration as a way of mitigating inequity and inequality, because you're helping people with less find a way to have more and a better life. And I think ultimately that's the shift. And part of the challenge, as you laid out, is it's not just about moving, it's about forming those communities and those town halls and those groups of people who can work together. And of course, coming from different cultures and countries and mixing can make that more challenging, but it's not an unsolvable problem, as many millions of people have shown. So
yeah, and I think the history of colonization, the impacts of the climate crisis, who caused it and who was harmed, will require a form of climate migration to remedy those historic wrongs. And so we won't have a choice. The question is, how do people see the flow of immigration? And would it be better in a world with 4 to 6, maybe 4 to 5 billion people in whom we've invested a lot to trust one another and to act in a way that's mutually self-regulating? Or are we just going to pretend that the creation of people has nothing to do with the world we live in, or we simply push it to drive growth so that we can get returns on our investment, and then pretend like the future that we'll inhabit is, just came about by itself. That wasn't driven by policies. I mean, the future we're in, the time that we live in today, the crises we live in today, the result of the population policies of the past. What mistakes were made, and why are we continuing to make them? That's the question.
Yeah, and maybe once we've got to that stage where we've brought the level up and rebalanced and had a chance to more democratically think through the next wave of advanced technologies, then we can push on to 10 and 20 billion and, settle the galaxies, and who knows where after that.
If we were in a position to do so in a democratic, relatively self-determining way, then I guess I wouldn't have much of an argument against it at that point.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, it's been a fascinating story and a really interesting, intricate and important space. So yeah, thank you for your kind words and for your work. What's the best way of people following you personally and finding out more about Fair Start?
Sure. Well, the best thing is our website at fairstartmovement.org, fairstartmovement.org. And then on February 10th, I'll launch a channel on Roundtable Media under my name, Carter Dillard, just as sort of a journalist reporting on the Fair Start movement. And mostly, I think, calling out philosophies, claims, policies that make the mistakes that we've talked about today, making sure that people know that, the crises we face today are based on a series of mistakes, like assuming the act of creating our children is more personal to parents than interpersonal to the children. So both Carter Dillard at Roundtable and, most importantly, fairstartmovement.org, because the impact both on humans and non-humans of changing the way we plan families completely outweighs other policy interventions because of the long-term impact. So thank you for creating a place for us to talk about this, Jamie. It's invaluable, and the rest of your episodes are as well. I love listening to them. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being a listener and a subscriber. Yeah. Okay, well, I will let you carry on with your day. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Jamie. You take care.